When I started this role with Imperial in culture, I had this moment of, have people coming to me and saying, well, what do you do? What do you really do on a day-to-day basis? And so in the spirit of TikTok memes, I came up with some things about what people think I do and what I actually do in terms of culture. So one of the things that people would come to me and they'd say, you're a cheerleader. You're just here to pump us up, right? And I would say, no, not quite. I had others that came to me and they said, so you're kind of like Mary Poppins, right? Spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. And I said, no, not quite that either. I also frequently was told I was the party planning committee, which I will be honest, a few days, once in a while, I am the party planning committee because we don't have fun outside of culture curation. And then other days, I would have people tell me, "Oh, so you're the Yoda. You're coming in and you're gonna, deliver this insight from on high." So as I mentioned with Chloe in the intro, I just felt like that didn't really get to the meat of what I was trying to do with culture. Because let's be honest, all of our companies already have some sort of culture. And some of us, we're trying to change it a little bit. We're trying to tweak it. We're trying to choose the right behaviors, the right experiences to figure out how that might help us get to the next level. And so that's where I came up with this culture curator term. And so a curator is somebody that comes from a gallery and actually gets to pick the paintings, to pick what is great, to, maybe put what's not so great in the back room. And so that was how I started to approach things. I approached them from this side of view where it was like, okay, well, I'm not here to create culture. I'm not here to just manage it. I am here to, show us and highlight to the organization what is the best of, and also what might not be the best of. So the purpose of this keynote today is really to focus on that cross-section between sales and culture. So as Chloe mentioned as well, I have had probably about 14 years of sales and marketing experience. And when my company came to me and asked me to take this role of culture manager, I was a little confused because the woman before me was a PhD in organizational psychology. So I had a little imposter syndrome, I'll be honest. And I was, thinking to myself, what am I doing here? But then when I thought back about my roles in sales and how I've defined myself, it's really by somebody who can listen attentively, and then also someone who can figure out the how. So how do we get from that strategy? How do we get from that vision of what we want to be from where we are today? And so what I'm going to share with you is I'm going to share with you a couple stories and a couple of my early tips in terms of what's worked for me for curating a culture in sales. Now, I am going to be honest. I'm going to start with some of the general stuff. And I will be very clear here too. This culture space, how do we influence culture? It is very gray area. So some things may work for one company, which don't work for others. So I also have a couple other little stories that I'm going to share with you along the way that'll help you see things from outside of kind of one company's viewpoint. Okay, so one of the things that we needed to get right when I found I was in this culture role is common language. So when I think about cultures, very strong cultures, I tried to step back from business a little bit. And I tried to think, okay, what are some of the strong cultures that we see in our world today? And so, I was looking at things like indigenous tribes, drag culture, all of these different movements that have their own language, their own stories that they pass down to people. And so I had to start off with, okay, so what is culture? What is that common language that we can all rally behind and get to? And if you have done any research on culture, you will know that every single person has their own definition for it. Simon Sinek says it's beliefs versus plus values. I've had it described in other ways in terms of, the human side of getting at our strategic goals. But I found that wasn't really speaking to people's hearts in our organization. And so a few weeks back, this wasn't that long ago, I was sitting in front of a bunch of our first line supervisors, and they wanted to hear about our culture strategy. They wanted to hear about my objective. And so, of course, being a good, slide person, I went and I put up my objective, and it was, all about and consistently embedding the cultural behaviors that we want so that it's accessible for everybody, with the end goal of employee engagement and productivity and blah, 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 blah. I could see their eyes just glazing over as I was saying this. And I thought to myself, okay, you know what? I think this makes sense logically. This makes sense up here, but it's not really hitting people in their heart of hearts. And so, being a good culture curator, I quickly thought back onto all the reading that I was doing. And I said, you know what? Let's take a step back for a moment. What we're trying to do here in terms of changing our culture is give people more good days at work. So you can see Miss Emma Bridger, I don't know if you can see on the source there, but Emma Bridger and Belinda Ganaway, they wrote this book. It's called Employee Experience by Design. And they talk about this concept of more good days at work. And what I found is that immediately after I said that, everybody was asking for the Zoom background. Let's get a Zoom background for it. Let's talk about this more. And for about a month afterwards, any meeting I would go into, somebody who I hadn't even talked to about this had their Zoom background up. So yes, I am judging the success of our culture movement by proliferation of Zoom backgrounds at this point, everybody. But what that showed me is it showed me that we now had a common understanding of what we were trying to do with culture, and one that was catching on, that was catching fire across the organization. Now, one of the other things that I learned very early on is I would sit in meetings with my coworkers, not just at my company, but at other companies as well too. And everybody wanted to talk about the company, right? The company, what the company should be doing, what systems we should change, what the senior leaders should be doing. And it kind of struck me, not as odd, because I think it's human behavior. I'm guilty of that. I've done that at all points in my career, talking about the company or what somebody else should be doing. And so I think the phenomenon that I was seeing was actually this one. And it goes back to a Tolstoy quote. When we ask people who wants change in terms of culture, we see hands go up everywhere. Everybody wants change. But the reality is when you ask them who wants to change, well, I was getting crickets. And so at this point, what I realized is we had a bit of a problem with accountability and span of control. So most people, they looked around them and they thought about culture and they said, well, I can't change anything because I can't change the incentive structure and I can't change, our performance assessment system. But the reality is that where culture lives and breathes, what defines it is really in the millions of little interactions that we have with each other on a daily basis. And so what I tried to start doing with folks is I tried to start getting them to that point where we were talking about span of control, where we were talking about how do I help others have more good days at work? How do I help myself have more good days at work? And now I have a personal rule where if you want to come to me and we want to talk about the company and we want to talk about culture changes in organization, I am more than willing to listen. But guess what? We're going to walk away with a job. And that job might be simple. I had a young man come to me and he was talking about how, it always seems like the special few are the ones who get highlighted in front of the company, who get invited up on stage, who get profiles put on them on the intranet. And so I said to him, yeah, you know what? I agree. It is kind of those special few who tend to get highlighted. And so I asked him, I said, can you help me? Can you help me find the people who don't want to appear boastful, who see themselves as very humble, so that I can highlight them and highlight their stories? And so he's been feeding me stories for quite some time now, which is great. So finding that kind of job and taking that energy and turning it into something that is productive is a great way to build some of that accountability. The other thing that I hear a lot in terms of culture is I hear a lot about, it's top down. So we need to see leaders role modeling those behaviors first. It's top down. That's how culture change is going to work. And I say yes. The other thing that I found is that I had a lot of people who had started grassroots culture movements in their own teams and their departments. And they would say to me, Lindsay, if we do change management in the regular sense, it's never going to work with culture. Culture is grassroots. Culture has to grow from the bottom up. And I would say, yes. The thing about culture change is that it really isn't your typical change management program. It is more akin to a social movement. And so there's this great article, Curating again, from HBR, from Brian Walker and Sarah Sewell, and they talk about the dynamics of the social movement. And what always struck me is that, social movements, they typically start small. They typically start with some dissatisfaction with the status quo. So people identifying that something is wrong, that they need to change something within their culture. But then the ultimate goal of that grassroots movement is to change the institution. So when folks tell me, when they say, okay, it's top down, it's bottom up, I say it's both. Culture movement, culture change comes from both sides. And for those of you who are fans of HBO, it's also middle out. So it's also those middle managers who are not, on the grassroots level, but maybe not at the senior leader level, who make the difference. So it's very much all of us. So that's something I'm still working on. I'll be very transparent here. We are very much on a journey at our company in terms of changing our culture. But it seems that this is something that's kind of struck people that more good days at work is something that they can do, that they can be accountable for, that everybody in the organization is also accountable for. Now, I want to step back a little bit and tell you a little bit of the story, because now I've got the Pied Piper logo out here. So I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the story of the rats of Hanoi. So Hanoi in the early 1900s, so city in Vietnam, they actually had a problem with a rat infestation. So I think it was the governor general who had come to Hanoi, and he thought, okay, we're going to modernize the city. We're going to put in some sewer systems. And little did he know that he had created a nice, warm breeding ground for rats. So, as you would expect, he wanted to get rid of those rats. And so, they did all the things. They hired terriers to come in. They hired out work to people to come in and catch all these rats and round them up and get rid of the infestation. They had people also, cut off the tails of the rats as proof. And, they got paid for every tail that they brought in. So I think what happened is, over time, they thought, okay, well, we're going to get rid of the rat problem. Little did they know that people actually started breeding rats once they knew that they would be paid for them. And so I'm using this as a bit of an alliteration to get us into the sales culture part of this, because I think what that story shows is it shows that our incentives will drive behavior. And so when I think about sales, and when I think about some of the biggest culture problems that we probably have, burnout, our bro culture, lone wolf syndrome, attrition, all of these things, to me, it heavily comes back to what our incentive structure is, which is typically commission. I'm going to share with you something at our company that we've always done. So you may think it's a little bit backwards, but that's okay. When I was in sales, I did not get commission. My salary was base. And then each year, depending on how I performed, I would get a year-end bump. So to my salary, not a bonus, not a one-time bonus, an increase to my base salary. The reason that I mention that is because, in our sales organizations, what I saw people helping each other out. I saw people trying to be inclusive and pull people onto their team. I saw people that were invested in the success of others and helpful. And quite frankly, we had sales personnel who had been in those jobs for 30, 40 years. Now, I get it. Different industry, different kind of point in time as well, too. I mean, that was, a good 10, 15 years ago. But I think that speaks to something in terms of how we can actually go about culture change, and specifically with sales. So one of the first things that you need to do, obviously, is you need to diagnose what is wrong. So in terms of diagnosing culture, you've got three options. You can do kind of the consulting route. You can go to consultants. You can have a big survey done. An engagement survey is usually what they call them. There are a lot of tech companies too, some of which you may belong to, that have popped up recently that do more real-time surveying. So they will connect into your HR information system and allow you to push out surveys at different points in time, during the year. And then lastly, you can kind of go the self-designed route. So this is the route where, maybe you're creating some surveys, maybe you're looking at your existing data. Maybe it's Glassdoor, maybe it's you have some additional surveys, maybe it's coffee chats with your leaders. The one thing I will say about those options to diagnose is that there are a few key things. Whatever you do, you want to make sure that you're sharing back with the organization, so that you're giving them some transparency in terms of what they're seeing and what is different. There's also a risk between when you share these results and when people will expect to see action. So one thing I talk about a lot is the news cycle that we're on these days versus what we used to be on in the past. I know a lot of you will have experienced this. But basically, you need to be able to take those results, look at them fairly quickly, and then at least take some sort of action. So with respect to that, once you kind of have your survey data, it's always helpful to go out into the organization and talk to people. What I've found is, even if you have open text on surveys, you don't necessarily get all the context to figure out what it is you need to be doing a little bit differently. So you may get lots of information on the things that are wrong, but it doesn't really get you to okay, so how can I go out and actually change? So what I've found is that there are generally three areas, and you can divide them out however you like. But what I found is there are generally three areas where you can make change happen. And so a couple different companies that I've seen do this and heard about doing this. One of them is actually Microsoft. So Microsoft, they started on this culture change journey quite a few years ago. And they found that they were a very siloed organization. So they had trouble getting people to share information across those silos. And another thing that they had problems with was growth mindset as well, too. So knowing that those things were what they needed to change, they went back and they said, okay, what are the mechanisms that we have in place that will actually allow us to change those things? And one of the things they did is they actually went into their performance assessment process, and they said, okay, this year, instead of doing, your step outs, instead of doing how you contributed only as an individual, you're going to give us three things. You're going to give us, okay, the traditional impact that you have, but you're also going to give us how you contributed through others and how you're leveraging others for your success. So by going into their system, identifying what was wrong, and then making changes in the system, they were able to change aspects of their culture. So that's one example. Another example is Softway. I'm sure some of you know of them. They just launched a great book called Love as a Business Strategy. I highly recommend it on how they changed their culture. And what's interesting is people now come to them for training, for leadership, in terms of culture change as well, too, because of how successful they were. So where Softway focused, one area, they focused on a lot, but I'll just give you one story, was in practices. And so they have offices in the US, they also have offices in India. And one thing they found is that when their executives traveled from the US to India, They were met at the airport. They were shown to their hotel room. Every night, they made sure that somebody was there to be able to, entertain them, take them out for dinner. But when the roles were reversed, when their Indian counterparts came to the US, they did none of that. So Softway has their theory, and theirs is that they're leading with a culture of love. And so they realized that practice of not welcoming their counterparts from India, not making them feel included, was really hurting that culture of love. And so they turned it around. So when executives would come over, somebody would meet them at the airport. They would make sure they got into their hotel room. There was a gift basket of personalized goodies there for them as well, too. So they took those extra steps to make sure that people felt included. And that's how they changed one of their practices. Now, by far the hardest area to change are your beliefs, right? Because, let's be real here. How many people have changed a belief in the past year when somebody said, I think you should do this, or I think you should do that? Probably not. Beliefs are something that we need to change inadvertently. And so for this particular one, so at Imperial, what we had found as one of our issues is that we had this disconnect. We had this disconnect with our managers walking the talk. So a lot of employees, what they would say is my manager does one thing, and then they go and they do another thing. Others would describe it as, that cognitive dissonance, right? Like you say you're going to do one thing and then you're doing this other thing. And so something that we've been working on here is we've been working a lot about talking about your intention as a leader and the impact it has on others. And so what this means, or how this shows up, is that, when we think about culture, when we think about more good days at work and our span of control, there are only a few things that we can control, really. And one of them is our behavior as managers, as supervisors. It's how we treat other people, right? And so that is firmly within our control. But it's not enough just to try and change your behavior. It's not enough to go through the check boxes and say, you know what, I am going to be better at promoting innovation in my organization. And here's the list of 20 things that I'm going to do. Because what we found is that people can have an intention and it can be misinterpreted. And so the only way to understand if your behavior change is working or not is to talk to your employees, to talk to your peers, to talk to other managers, your manager, to see how that intention is impacting other people. This is something we talk a lot about in the inclusion and diversity space too. It's that, your intention can be great, but the impact that it has on others is more powerful because it's larger. It reaches more people. So those are kind of three areas that we're focused on. And my last slide I'm going to show you here today is, our second last really, is how we're trying to close that gap between our aspirational vision for culture and our lived experiences to bring those closer together. And so we've just started on this journey. But what I wanted to share with you is this concept of employee experience design. So I know a lot of you come from kind of the technology space, and so you'll be very familiar with customer experience design and user experience design. So we use this today. We use this when we develop products. We use this when we talk about how our customers find us and are able to locate us and choose us ultimately. And so this whole concept of employee experience design is basically taking those concepts, those same user design thinking principles, and turning them around to look at how our employees are experiencing things. The first step in this process, I'm not going to go through it all, but the first step in this process is very important, and that's developing your personas. So figuring out who are those distinct groups of people who work for you, who have different views on different issues. This is something that we're digging into right now, but the key to it is that it starts with empathy, right? So it starts with putting ourselves in the shoes of others, which is when I think back to intention versus impact. That's where we need to understand that linkage once again. Putting ourselves in other people's shoes helps us understand that impact. ultimately, what you do after this is you say, okay, our employees have this journey from when they are hired to when they're onboarded, maybe they get their first job, all the way through to when they retire or perhaps leave the company. And so the next part of this process is to sort of start to identify what are those peak experiences and what are those valleys as well, too, that each of those personas is having. And once you get to that point, ultimately, you want to get to this innovate and experiment stage where you're trying to build those peaks even higher and fill in some of those valleys. So the other important point about this kind of model or this process is it starts with empathy and it ends with experimentation. Because like I said at the beginning, there's no black and white in culture. It is all gray area. And so that's one other thing that I'm trying to work on as well is, getting us away from this expectation that we're going to get it 100% right the first time. We can't expect perfection when it comes to culture. We can only try things and then figure out if it works. If it doesn't, we can go back to the drawing board. So on that note, my experience with culture is really been, we're taking 2 steps forward. And then sometimes it's 1 step back. And so it's important to understand that as you go on this journey, we'll try and build momentum. We're all trying to build that momentum, but it's not always going to be perfect. It's not always going to be easy. And so I went back and I thought about, a little bit more this role of culture curator and what we're all trying to do with respect to culture. To me, there's kind of 3 prongs to any role where you're responsible for culture. The first is that you're a guide. You're trying to help people along. You're trying to not define the how, but help them see the what. You're also you're also meant to be a conduit for other people's stories. So helping lift others up, helping kind of show them that they have some accountability, but also that they have it within their power to change culture. And then lastly, in my role, I know that I am a connector. So one of the very important things I do is I see all of these things across the organization that others are doing. And I try and connect them so that they can use that knowledge and share it with each other to get to a better place. And on that note, I would also like to connect with many of you. So you can find me. I'm Lindsay Lackner Davey on LinkedIn, and I would love to hear your stories. I would love to hear what you think, what resonated with you today about this, because I don't have it all figured out. I haven't written the book on this. And so I think the best that we can do sometimes is just share what's worked for us and figure it out that way.